Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm the author of Traumainformed Principles in Group Therapy, Psychodrama, and Organizations, Action Methods for Leadership. And in this video, I want to take you through Chapter 1 of this book, Introduction to Trauma-Informed Group Therapy, Psychodrama, and Organizations. This is a book that was just published in April 2023 and really outlines much of what I've learned throughout my career as a practitioner, as a mental health professional, as a trauma therapist, as a group therapist, as a psychodramatist, supervisor, educator, researcher, and organizational leader. So I tried to integrate all my learning from all the different roles into this little book. And my hope is that you'll find the book helpful in your work. So the first chapter really goes into an introduction and an overview of what to expect throughout the book. It begins by talking a little bit about my own journey in being introduced to psychodrama, my own personal growth, and then as a professional, and my journey of learning trauma-informed care and trauma therapy as a professional. I really started my career in the addictions field. And one of the things that I noticed working in addiction treatment, working in the criminal justice system, my first social work internship was at a juvenile law center. And at the same time, being very engaged in social activism, that the thing that seemed to unite all three of these areas I was working in was trauma. That everyone that was in treatment for substance use disorder had experienced trauma. Oftentimes it was fueling their drinking or their drug use or their relapse. Everybody that was in the criminal justice system seemed to have experienced trauma, victims and perpetrators. And all of the social activism that I was doing really was around collective trauma. Pretty much all social injustice is essentially collective trauma. I started to see that trauma seemed to play a role in all of the problems, to some degree, all of the individual problems, family problems, group problems, community problems, and even socio and political problems. And so I decided to devote my career to better understanding trauma and working with trauma at all these different levels. So the beginning of Chapter 1 really goes into a bit of my journey, and you'll get to know a little bit more about how I ended up where I'm at and who I learned some of these ideas from, because I've had lots of really incredible mentors along the way. The next part of Chapter 1 goes into talking about the difference between group work and group therapy. And so really emphasizing that group work and group therapy are two different things. Group work is the larger umbrella under which group therapy is a part of, in addition to other types of non-clinical groups. And so in this book, all the concepts that are discussed relate to group work in general, and more specifically, group psychotherapy. So I really approached this book through the lens of a group therapist, as a group worker, and consider that all of the theories and ideas and tools, all the things that I know as a group therapist, can also help me better understand society as a large group, and can better help me understand organizations. And an organization is essentially just a group of people, and that the tools, the ideas, the phenomenon that we understand and implement within therapy groups can also be modified and used within organizations to promote healthy organizational functioning. Another main component of this book is psychodrama and sociometry. So the next section in Chapter 1 goes through what is psychodrama and what is sociometry. So psychodrama is an experiential form of therapy, although it's also used outside of therapy, that involves some role-playing and techniques from the theater. It allows us to externalize some of the parts of ourselves or problems we might be experiencing, and to really work through them in action rather than just sitting and talking about them. So in psychodrama, we might use things like the empty chair technique, or role reversal, or enacting scenes through role-playing related to healing from trauma, or future situations that we might want to practice rehearsing before we find ourselves in them. Psychodrama emerged within the triadic system of Jacob Moreno, the founder of Psychodrama. And the triadic system has three parts: sociometry, psychodrama, and group psychotherapy. Many people don't realize that Jacob Moreno actually coined the term group psychotherapy and was one of the pioneers in developing group therapy. He really believed that we couldn't do true group therapy until we first learned and created tools for assessing groups. That just like in individual treatment or therapy, we have to first start with assessment. We have to understand what are some of the underlying problems, what's the presenting issue, what is it that we want to treat, and what are our goals. We have to do all that before we start offering treatments or interventions. And so he argued that we really couldn't do real group therapy until we learned how to start with group assessments. And this is where sociometry comes in. Moreno created an entire sociometric theory, practice, and research methodology that allows us to explore in action the underlying dynamics and sociodynamics within groups, within organizations, within communities, and within all of society. So as a psychodramatist, I usually will use sociometry as the warming up process, the first phase of the group, psychodrama as the action phase of the group, where we get into the tougher content and material, and then more traditional group psychotherapy, sharing, as the third phase of the group for integration and closure. So in any kind of psychodrama or experiential group, there's these three phases: warm up, action, and sharing. And they usually follow the three elements of the triadic system: sociometry, psychodrama, group psychotherapy. And so I get into all these details and more in the section on introducing psychodrama and sociometry in chapter 1 of the book. Then we start to talk about trauma-informed care. What is trauma-informed care? Everybody seems to be claiming that they're trauma-informed, that they're a trauma-informed therapist, a trauma-informed program, a trauma-informed organization. My experience has been that most people that use the term couldn't tell you exactly what it means, couldn't tell you what the 6 trauma-informed principles are outlined by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration. It's almost like trauma-informed has just become a sexy marketing slogan, and it's losing its meaning because people are using it carelessly. People are claiming it when they don't fully understand what it means. We're not using it precisely in the same way. So this section really gets into some of the nuances of trauma-informed care. For example, understanding the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. For example, understanding the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. We're looking at the 10 different agency domains within which we need to be implementing trauma-informed care. And I've created separate videos on all 3 of those if you really wanted to learn more about them in a video format. Next, in chapter 1, I talk about trauma-informed leadership. And so I really emphasize here how trauma-informed care philosophy is not just for practitioners, that it's often a parallel process in implementing trauma-informed care principles and philosophies in our practices, but also in our procedures and policies and in our leadership. That the more a leader embodies trauma-informed care principles and practices, the more the rest of the staff are going to embody trauma-informed care principles and practices. That we have to be doing it. We can't just be saying that we're doing it or be telling other people to do it. But as leaders, we really have to be practicing in ways that are trauma-informed. We have to be leading, teaching, mentoring, resolving conflict, setting up our organization in ways that are trauma-informed. This means we have to take into account the way that trauma impacts our community, impacts our clients, and how most of our staff are probably going to be trauma survivors. And that if we're working directly with trauma in our organizations, we have to consider the impact of vicarious trauma, of traumatic countertransference. And we have to create organizational structures that support our staff and employees, that help them become the best that they can be, that help them prevent burnout, And one of the later chapters in the book really focuses exclusively on that topic. So trauma-informed leadership means that we're practicing what we're preaching, that we're doing our own personal growth work, that we're considering the ways that we can resist re-traumatizing, not just our clients, but also our staff. One of the things that has shocked me in the field and in the research is that most people that experience burnout and even vicarious trauma, they experience it because of their organization and their leadership, not because of the clients they're working with. So as trauma-informed leaders, we really have to make sure that we're supporting our staff and our employees, our colleagues, that we're not making the work more difficult for them. So much of trauma happens because people in power, people in positions of power, people that have authority over others, abuse their power or neglect their responsibilities. So as trauma-informed leaders, we have to use our power for good. We have to be aware of the ways that we might unintentionally cause harm and be willing to make amends, to correct that, to mitigate that, to prevent re-traumatization. Being a trauma-informed leader means that we also have to work from an anti-oppressive lens. I think, especially in organizational dynamics, but also in clinical practice, one of the most common ways that folks are re-traumatized is by reenactments of oppression, reenactments of discrimination, or dehumanization based on identity. So as trauma-informed leaders, we have to be aware of our own identities, our own cultural background, our own race, our own gender, and how that might intersect with and impact somebody else's experience with us, especially as a leader, based on their identity, based on their gender, their race, their sexuality, their cultural background or religion. So chapter 1 really presents trauma-informed leadership. And then at the end of the book, the final chapter, chapter 12, really goes into more detail about trauma-informed leadership and emphasizes the importance of ethics. That we can't truly do trauma-informed care, trauma-informed leadership, trauma-informed practice if we're not also practicing with ethics. The next section in chapter 1 goes through and talks about the difference between trauma-informed and trauma-focused services. That when we're talking about trauma-informed care, we need to also differentiate trauma-informed services from trauma-focused or trauma-centered services. That these are two different things. Ideally, they'd be integrated together, and that we would provide trauma-focused services through a trauma-informed framework, but trauma-informed and trauma-focused are different. Unfortunately, many professionals confuse these terms and use them interchangeably, which only creates more confusion. Trauma-informed describes the larger framework, the larger philosophy, the larger process of providing services. And trauma-informed care philosophy is applicable in every agency, regardless of which types of services are provided. You can implement trauma-informed care philosophy in any business, any hospital system, educational systems, any human services system, and even other corporate settings. Whereas trauma-focused services are really focused on providing treatment for trauma and all the different ways it manifests in our clients today, treating PTSD and complex PTSD and other trauma-related issues. So trauma-focused is about treating trauma. Trauma-informed is about providing our services in our organization in ways that recognize that how trauma impacts us and responds in ways that resist re-traumatization and provide ideal conditions for our clients, customers, folks receiving services, community members, students, employees to be able to thrive, to be able to receive services without barriers. So again, ideally, we would be providing trauma-focused services through a trauma-informed framework and lens. When we're working with trauma, it's also important that we're working from a 3-stage clinical map for safe and effective trauma work. That there's 3 phases here. We start with safety, with stability, with resourcing, working with strengths and psychoeducation, forming that relationship or group cohesion. And we don't move into reprocessing trauma until we first accomplish the tasks associated with this first phase: safety, strengths, cohesion. Otherwise, when we move into the second phase, trauma processing, we could cause re-traumatization if we haven't first attended to safety and strengths. So this is where we do skill building, cultivate safety, build a relationship with the client. Then we move into processing the trauma. This is where we get into the memories, perhaps, where we get into the anger, the grief, the shame, the guilt, the hyperarousal, the panic, all the defenses, the sadness, the difficult aspects of the trauma. And we can't just stop there. We have to next look to the third phase of the clinical map, which is about growing from trauma, integrating our experience into a coherent narrative about ourselves. It's about trauma recovery, looking to the future, transformation. How can we grow from this? Who am I beyond my trauma? What are ways that I can use my traumatic experiences to help others? How has my experience of adversity and my experience of trauma therapy challenged me to grow and be better as a human being? So these are all attended to in that third phase. So we've got phase 1, safety, strengths, skills, psychoeducation, relationships. Phase 2, trauma processing, working with defenses, difficult emotions, grief and anger. And phase 3, looking to the future, trauma recovery, post-traumatic growth, integration, and transformation. So the latter part of chapter 1 really dives into that 3-phase clinical map for safe and effective trauma work. So I really encourage you to check out the book and chapter 1. Here's the title of the book again: Trauma-Informed Principles in Group Therapy, Psychodrama, and Organizations. If you find the book useful and the content in the book useful, I encourage you to check out some of the other videos on the YouTube channel here, where I'll go through some of the other content in the book, or to purchase a copy of the book if you're really interested in reading it in detail. If you find the book helpful, the most helpful thing you could possibly do for a book author is to leave an Amazon review about the book, an honest Amazon review. The more Amazon reviews that a book has, the higher it'll show up in the search engine results when somebody searches for keywords related to that book, and the more likely future readers are going to find the book. So if you want to go above and beyond and find the book really useful and want to help others find this book, that would be the way to do it. I encourage you to reach out to me if you wanted to learn more about trauma-informed principles. You can find more information about me on the YouTube channel here or on my website. I really hope that you find this book and this video useful, and I hope that you have an excellent day. Thanks for watching.